Good afternoon, my beautiful people. I go by the name Sotadeology. In today's video, we're going to dissect this topic above, which is Sotadeology Lecture 21, Quantum Uncertainty to Complex Certainty. So now, I want us to use this first paper that I have right here. And when you look at the top, it says quantum mechanical description of physical reality, complete or incomplete, EPR paradox. Now, EPR paper was actually published by Einstein and two other scientists. And so I want to dissect the mechanics of uncertainty and how that evolves to complex certainty. Now, I said complex certainty because at quantum level, we have this uncertainty that says you can't, get position of quantum phenomenon and then, get the momentum at the same time. And it is for this reason that Einstein and that two other scientists published this paper. And so they concluded that quantum mechanics wasn't complete, or rather, let me say, quantum mechanics isn't complete, whichever way. So now, when you look at the first phrase that we have, it says, in a complete theory, there is an element of corresponding to each element of reality. It says, in a complete theory, there is an element corresponding to each element of reality. So what that is telling us is that before we can actually be ascertained of what reality is, then the theory that we're trying to model the reality must have every of its element pairing up with every element of that reality we're trying to model. So now, sufficient condition for the reality of a physical quantity is the possibility of proceeding or predicting rather with certainty without disturbing the system. Now, this condition is, I don't know, it's something that is so difficult to deal with, because when you're trying to measure something at quantum level, or you're trying to get, reality at quantum level, there is no way you cannot disturb the system, because the means of probing or the means of measuring at quantum level, we actually introduce, some kind of energy into the system, and that would make the system to be unstable. And as a result of that, we can't get to know reality. This is not only applicable to quantum mechanics. Even at classical level, we have this kind of uncertainty, but it is not related to, related to position and momentum as we have in the quantum mechanics. So rather, when you look at the way light is being measured, we have a range of light that we can actually see with our physical eyes. And from the measurement of light speed, we can get to know that by the virtue of time being different at, different intervals, then we can't actually measure light by having one-way measurement. And that is why we settled down for two-way measurement of light speed. and that happens to be the average measure of light speed. So in that case, you can get to see that the only way we can measure what is traveling in time is by having multiple of that object speed in time, which will be inversely related to each other. And by so doing, we're going to have the average measurement of that particular object speed. So now, with that, we can get to see that trait of uncertainty. But then you'll be able to see this inherent uncertainty clearly as we progress, because in this particular video, we're going to dissect the feasibility of global now. Global now is what Einstein said that is not possible, because he actually called it relativity of simultaneity. So once relativity is considered in a system, there is no way you can get a global system that is having events happening at far distance apart, happening at the same time. So now let's look at what I have in red pen, or the phrase that I have, or rather let me say the paragraph that I have written in red pen. However, the act of observing quantum system to measure its outcome disturbs the system. Therefore, quantum mechanics is incomplete. And that is the conclusion. That is the final conclusion of the EPR paper published in 1935. So now the issue that we have at hand now is the issue of getting to know the position and momentum at the same time. But then, of course, it is ideal to say quantum mechanics is incomplete, because if you can't actually track down position and momentum, there is no way you can get to know the exact position where the particle will land in the future. And because of that, then we know that we can just tag quantum mechanics to be incomplete based on that. At classical level, when you have a ball that you actually want to throw into a hook, you know that considering the weight of the ball and then positioning your hand with your projected calculation, you can throw the ball and then guess where the ball will land in the future. And it's because we know the momentum of that ball based on its weight, right? Based on its weight, then coupled with the force of, that that projection or projectile, as I would rather put it. When we throw the ball, we're going to have it in form of projectile into the hook. So now, but then let's see how we can actually dissect this uncertainty. And to do that, we're going to actually have operators for position and momentum. And for us to have that operation, it's actually going to be in form of what we have here, which is x hat multiplied with p hat, and that will not be equal to p hat multiplied with x hat. That is the kind of condition. And so if we then go further, we realize that when we consider the commutator of x hat and p hat, then we have square bracket as what we have right here. Then we have x hat, then p hat, and then by rearranging it in such a way that, in such a way to get the difference, we know the arrangement is going to be x hat p hat minus p hat x hat. And once we have this, we have to subtract the flipped version of the original from it in order for us to get the difference. So the difference is what we want to track right here. If the difference is not 0, then it means that the momentum and position, it actually means that momentum and position do not commute. So now that we have the arrangement the way it should be, and so we can just simply say that x at is the same thing as x, and by having x we can just say x is position, and then p at will then be minus iota, or we call it I, which stands for imaginary number. Then we have h bar, we have partial derivation over dx. That is going to serve as our momentum right there. But then there is something I want you to take note of, which is having the negative sign, then having the iota multiplied with h bar. So why must we have this imaginary number with h bar? If h bar is a real number, that is a complex system. But then why must we have complex system by the virtue of momentum? First of all, we need to know that every particle will actually go towards the low energy state, and low energy state is the trajectory of that negative sign as we have it. But then imaginary number is a number that is not visible within the real domain. So to me, I believe this number should actually come from the higher dimension. So if the visible domain is a substrate dimension, imaginary number should come from that higher dimension. And now the h bar, what is now the value of h bar? We know h bar is a constant, so it's a tiny value, you understand? And so we're going to dissect how we can use this value as we have here to dissect what we want to dissect. So now we have seen the trait of complex system right there, and then we know that the whole system should give us this quantum uncertainty, and that is why I titled this particular video Quantum Uncertainty to Complex Certainty. So now the h bar as we have it, I'm going to tag it flipping operator. I tag it flipping operator, and you get to know the reason I tag it flipping operator as we progress. So now let's look at what we have right here. So position, for us to actually have position, the condition of that system must be stable enough for us to be able to ascertain the position of anything in the space, or in a space, or rather any which way. So basically, if we call that point, if we have that point as this blue convergence as I have it right here, then if we move forward in space based on this value as we have it, then the convergence of the momentum should not be equal to the convergence of the position. And so in between the position and momentum, we're going to have what is known as relativity, because the movement away from the position will generate a central point. So if the position is moving towards the momentum, it will do so at equal speed as the momentum too will be moving towards the position. So that is the system right there. So now we now have this x at, p at, then we apply it with psi. Psi is a wave function. That is the quantum wave function. So we want to apply psi to that and see how that will actually evolve. So now now that we have this parameter, then its value is going to be negative I h bar multiplied with x, and so we're going to have partial derivation of psi over partial derivation of x. That is the value. So now we have another parameter which is going to be inverse of the initial one, and that will be p hat. That will be p hat multiplied with x hat, and then we apply psi function to that. And by applying psi function to that, what we're going to get will now be negative I h bar partial derivation over partial derivation of x. But then we're going to have the x value multiplied with psi function. So we enclose the two inside the square bracket. So definitely we have these two values to deal with. We have to multiply the momentum with x and then multiply it with, psi. For us to get our answer, we need to use product rule of differential calculus. And by using the product rule, then we're going to end up having this. What we now have will now be I h bar square bracket, we have x partial derivation of psi over partial derivation of x plus psi. So we now have that. Now based on what we have, you can then see that with this you can now see that the value that we have for this x hat multiplied with p hat psi is actually different from its inverse based on that what we have. Okay, so now we can track the difference to know what we get. To do that, we're going to have this x hat p hat minus p hat x hat. So we close that in square bracket, then we apply psi to it. So it means that the psi will be, multiplied with the two terms in the square bracket. And so we now have it to be this value. We have it to be this value. So we have the value, the initial value, to be minus iota h bar x partial derivation of psi over partial derivation of x plus I h bar in square bracket, we have x partial derivation of psi over partial derivation of x, then plus psi. So now we can cancel the partial derivation of psi to partial derivation, like partial derivation of psi over partial derivation of x as multiplied with x. We can just cancel the two terms as we have it right here. Then we now say that what we now have left is this iota h bar multiplied with psi. That's what we have. So now the difference is now a complex number. It's a complex number because we know h bar is a constant. It's a value, you understand? Multiplied with imaginary number, that shows that it's a complex number. Okay, so now let's now move further. So if we now take the x hat, comma, p hat, and we put it right inside the square bracket, we know the value we get is iota multiplied with h bar. That is the value, and that is not equal to 0. And that is the proof that position is not the same thing as momentum. So definitely, this is telling us that the convergence that we have in this singular or let me rather say the convergence we have in the singularity of Big Bang is not the same thing as the convergence that we have in the singularity of black hole. So definitely this is actually, proving what I discovered using formula of everything. You understand? By using formula of everything, I could see that we have one singularity to have this constancy of 1, then relative to another singularity having the value of 1.1, which is the remnant of electron. So that means that we have constancy in relation to variation. So now the symmetric nature of the universe must be broken at a certain point for us to have this asymmetric nature. And so now we see that there is this inherent asymmetric nature in the universe by having position not to be equal to momentum. And it is ideal for us to have this if we want to have continuous momentum, in the mechanics of the universe. So that is that. So now the difference factor is what I call flipping operator. You understand? So we have that flipping operator as a complex system, then it means that the flipping mechanism will be at complex level. So now we need to note what I have right here. H bar at classical level is too tiny to be significant. And that is the reason we could have deterministic results at classical level. Meanwhile, H bar is so huge, is of significant value at quantum level. In fact, it is so significant to cause uncertainty principle or to cause uncertainty mechanism. And why must it be so significant to cause it? The reason is because there is this speed difference factor. Now, in the nucleus, we have this energized momentum. It is constantly energized. The momentum is constantly energized in the nucleus, and that is the speed difference factor that we have. So now this constantly energized momentum, we try to maintain the constancy of light speed, but then the momentum, because at the nucleus we have this curvature that particle is negotiating, you understand, and so the additional energy will be accumulated in form of arbitrary mass worth. It is this arbitrary mass worth that will actually be equal. The generation of the arbitrary mass worth will be equal to the decaying value of the light speed at a point, and that will generate a standing wave that will connect us into the higher dimension. And the transition from the quantum realm to the complex level is what I call complex system. It comes with flipping mechanism. It's a complex system, and at the same time it is what we call quantum entanglement. Okay, so now at complex level, H bar is real to toggle with its counterpart. So now when we look at this at classical level, H bar is so insignificant to be recognized, and that is why we could have deterministic results. Fine. Then at quantum level, H bar is significant to cause uncertainty mechanism. So in either cases, it simply means that H bar is undefined. Let me rather put it like that. It means that H bar is significant. So at quantum level, you can't get the value of h bar. At quantum level, you can't get the value of h bar. But it's only at complex level that we can get the real value of h bar. And the reason we can't get the value of h bar at quantum level is for the fact that by the virtue of that energized momentum, we have this huge pressure, high temperature, so the h bar is undefined. But it can be defined at higher dimension, because higher dimension means higher degree of freedom and power. So considering the relativity right from the substrate dimension to the higher dimension, then we can have the real instantiation of h bar to be toggled with imaginary number, and that gives us complex system. So this complex system we will actually we're going to track it further into feasibility of life. And so we're going to dissect the nature of DNA for us to get more understanding of this. So now, then, once we have that toggling of imaginary number to its real counterpart, h bar, then we can actually have the flipping mechanism at higher dimension, but then the trajectory of everything is known as static and undulating transition, or static and undulating trajectory, and that is the trajectory of time. So basically, in that static and undulating, I call it static and undulating field, that is where we can actually have cohorting of localization and globalization. We know that quantum entanglement is all about globalization, because information can be transmitted instantly across vast distance. Then at classical level, we have this localization, which simply means that particle can only be affected by its immediate local environment, unlike the globalization where we have this global transmission of information. Okay, so now, good. So this static and undulating field is so tiny that it's more or less like almost instant, but not instant, almost instant. And that is where we have reality of the universe. So now, it follows that experience, which is contact sensation, and observation, which is suspended sensation, must be fused together at complex level as emergent reality of objectivity that is void of disturbance, ensured by superconductivity. We know in superconductivity, we often have this unified identity. And it's synonymous to quantum entanglement. When you have quantum entanglement, the initial wave pattern is not different from the later wave pattern. And superconductivity, we have this unified identity such that the unified particles will be the same. And that is, the reality of the universe. And that is where we even have, the virtue of consciousness. So now, solution of FOE. FOE is formula of everything. If you have been following me, you will be so conversant with that formula. And that formula is what I have right here, which is the T, the M, equal to capital UM plus 4M. Now, this formula is so powerful that it feeds back on itself. What that means is that it's a formula that when you use an input to generate an output, you can as well use the generated output as input to further generate output. And so with that, by reiterating the application of this formula, we're able to get this decaying virtue of electron right inside the singularity where it is being suspended as 1.1, which is different from the initial value that we get at the present phase, which let me actually use this diagram to better explain that. Now, the thing is, when you use this formula of everything, let's say you use this quantum mass worth, which is 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 31 kilogram. If you put that in the place of the two m's in the formula, what you're going to have will be this classical counterpart, which is 2,277,250,000 kilogram. That is the classical counterpart of that quantum mass worth. Now, if you use this classical value, if you put it in the place of the two m's in the formula, then the answer you are going to get will be this answer, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power 48. Now, this value as we have it, we know it's actually, feasible at classical realm. But then, if you expand this value in standard form, then you are going to get this 5.7 times 10 raised to power 32. You are going to have a couple of zeros, which will suspend this big blue convergence that we have here at 32nd position. Now, this big blue convergence is what I call classical arbitrary suspension. Now, let's see where the trajectory is actually coming from. Now, we can see that the trajectory is coming from the singularity of Big Bang. It is diagonal. So the trajectory is this diagonal line. And then you can see that we have this blue line up to the center, and then we have red line emerging from the singularity of the Big Bang. And there you can see that we have it to be relativity. Now, this trajectory as we have it, that is the constancy of gravity. It actually models the trajectory of time relative to energy. Now, what we have down here is the trajectory of energy, which is the constancy of light. Now, we have the action of gravitational field in time, which must as well have reaction of that in energy. And so we have constancy of light speed to the constancy of gravitation field. So now you can see that the suspension is equal because we have the suspension to be 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 32, which is the same thing as what we have right here, 5.7 times 10 raised to power 32. This one is 32. Why this one is negative 32? Because it's an inverse of that one. And then we have 5.7 times 10 raised to power 48 right here. But inverse of that will be 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 48, just as we have it right here. But then it is now left for us to actually close this gap. So when you look at that action and reaction, action of time to reaction of energy, that is the divergence of classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. And then we need to bridge that gap. And the only way we can bridge the gap is to manually annihilate the suspended zeros. Then one thing I need you to know is that 0 is the same thing as 0 could actually serve as a placeholder for 9. Because when you look at 9 as we have it, it emulates the instancy of time's default status. What do I mean by that? For instance, let's say if you multiply if you double 3 or you double 6, you are going to have that value, the generated value, to alternate between 3 and 6. But if you double 9 or you have 9, you will constantly get 9. So now, for instance, let's say you have 3. If you double that 3, 3 times 3 will give you 6. If you double the 3 such that you have 2 times 3 will give you 6. Okay? So now, that is 6. Now, if you double that 6, 2 times 6 will give you 12. 12 is more than digit, is actually more than digit that we can have from 0 to 9. And so for you to get the digital root, you say 1 plus 2, that will give you 3. So now, if you want to double the 12, 12 times 2 will give you 24. It is more than the digit. If you now add 2 to 4, that will give you 6. Now, with that, you can say the alternating of 6 and 3. But if it were to be 9, if you say 9 times 9, if you say 9 times 2, I like to do exponentials. That's why you see me saying 9 times 9. I don't know. Okay, so now if you say 2 times 9, that will give you 18. It's more than digit. So 1 plus 8 will give you 9. You understand? So then that 18 as we have it, if you multiply that by 2, you will see that when we get the digital root, it will still be 9. You understand? So we will continually have 9 like that. And you can see that 9 is not changing because it emulates the default nature of time. So time, let me briefly say that time by default is instant. When time is in relativistic scaling with energy, it becomes continuous. Then energy, on the other hand, too, has two identities. Energy by default is infinite, but when energy is in relativistic scaling with time, then it becomes discrete. Let's take note of that. Let's know that. So now, when we now annihilate, like when we manually annihilate the suspended zeros, then we can actually have this vertical trajectory as we have it to bridge the divergence between quantum. Now this whole area, this whole region is the quantum realm, while this up whole region is the classical realm. Okay, so now by annihilating the suspended zeros, we're going to bridge this divergence as we have it. But then don't forget that what we have here, which is the classical arbitrary suspension, has accumulated energy, which is known as potential energy. And so if that energy should be used such that we have free fall, then we know that is what we have there is known as classical gravity. So spontaneously, we're going to have the free fall. And that free fall will be from this big blue convergence, then down to this red big convergence. That is where the free fall will stop. But then what do we have from this big red convergence to the curved region of the energy? What do we have there? What we have there is known as quantum nucleus. Quantum nucleus, because we have a compacted equilateral triangle, and because it is being compacted, then we're going to have this constantly accelerated momentum. Now, constantly accelerated momentum, because it is accelerated, there will be influx of additional energy. The influx of additional energy will be, arbitrary mass convergence. And that is what we actually allow us to have, smooth convergence alignment to this energy curvature. And once we have that, we're going to have what is known as standing wave. It is that standing wave that will actually project us into higher dimension. Now, you can see that the real quantum mass worth, look at real quantum mass worth, it's even outside the constraint of time energy wave. So this whole area, this whole region is what I call the substrate dimension. It is the 2D dimension. So now we can see that that is being connected to another, wave time curvature or diagram. So that I call higher dimension, which is 3D in this case. Now the quantum mass worth that we are connected to there, that is the quantum electron of the higher dimension, and that will be instantly flipped to the positron. And by having it to be positron, that is when the electron of the substrate dimension can be initiated. So once we have that, negative sign plus sign will attract, and so we're going to have injection of the positron right inside the substrate dimension. That will energize, because this phase is a low energy state. The energy is so low, and it is too low that we can't even have momentum into the black hole singularity. So it is that injection of that positron that we actually propel momentum towards the black hole singularity. Okay, that being said, with that, we now know that we need to manually annihilate. So if you want to get to know how the suspended zeros are being annihilated, I have video on that where you can see how this formula of everything is thoroughly applied. You understand? And if you want to get how this formula of everything is derived, I have another video where you can get that. So now, with that, you can get to see that we have a complex system to be this transition from the substrate dimension into the higher dimension. Then right inside the transition, we have what is known as quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement, you can see what I have here. Quantum entanglement, also known as complex system, also known as superconductivity. So we have the emergence of electron when the electron of the higher dimension is being flipped to positron, and that is quantum entanglement. You have electron to positron. So that is that. So now, with this, we can see that there is more or less like this external introduction of energy into the substrate. And basically what we have right here, the flipping mechanism, is what I called God's signature in Sotadeology. If you really want to know about flipping mechanism, you will need to watch the whole series of Sotadeology for you to have the understanding of that flipping mechanism. There are two flipping systems in the universe. We have dimensional flipping mechanism, and then we have relativistic flipping mechanism. Watch all the series for you to understand. So the flipping mechanism, you have it everywhere. You have the projection of light being flipped such that you have it being flipped, and so the image generated, the image you are observing, the real image, will be the original image, but the virtual image that will be generated in your eyes will be flipped to that original image. And that is why in the projector, you could see that in the projector, the image that is being projected right inside the projector is flipped, and so we need to turn it upright before it could be projected onto the screen. So that is the whole system. Light is flipped because light, photon travels in time, and that is why we could only have two measures of two-way measurement of light. So everything in the universe will have to experience that flipping mechanism. Even right inside the DNA, we have the flipping mechanism, and that is why we have this double helix, of DNA strands. You understand? So this flipping mechanism is the signature of Almighty God. And so we are going to, track this down to DNA as well to see what reality we can get in that respect. Okay. So now we now know how this works. And then don't forget that the instant feedback of locating this positron and having this electron of the substrate being initiated, the feedback of that information will be instantly transmitted to this classical mass worth, and that is what I call objective conscious experience. So this vertical trajectory, when you look at it, you can see that it is actually longer than normal. It should stop at the end of this triangle, but then it didn't stop. You can see it being projected even beyond the limit of energy, you understand, into higher dimension. And so you can see that now we have one equilateral triangle here. What we have here is equilateral triangle, don't get it twisted. But then it has this inherent asymmetric nature, which I will, dissect further. But then let's look at how it operates. When you look at this region, you see that we could not have any real mass, any real quantum mass inside this region. But at classical level, we have real classical mass worth right inside the system. So that is telling you that quantum mechanics decays mass worth. It is not entertaining any form of mass worth. And so we could say that is why it is ideal for us to say that photon is massless, you understand? Because that is where photon is massless. With this, we can actually prove that photon is massless because the quantum mechanics is not entertaining any form of mass worth. So the place where you could have emergence of mass worth will have to be right inside the nucleus. And then you can see that if left with quantum mechanics alone, you can't have instantiation of electron. You can't. Now, it follows that the momentum, the energy gap that we need for us to have spontaneous symmetry breaking at this big red convergence, that energy gap has to, span from classical mechanics down to quantum mechanics. So if you look at the relativistic quantum solution of the rack was able to see, the higher dimension, so he called it the rack C. And so you can see that because the rack used Schrödinger wave equation, you understand, with what is it called? Special relativity, which is this EMC squared, plus the momentum as we have it, because it used that Schrödinger wave equation, using Planck constant, using all the quantum parameters, elements. By using those things, that has constrained the solution such that we could then, such that we now, in that Dirac solution, there was this gap between the higher dimension and the substrate dimension. And then Dirac proposed solution by saying that when we have radiation, huge radiation, then we could have, holes in that Dirac sea, which would serve as, positron. And only when we have the positron that positron can attract, electron from the substrate dimension, such that we then have connection, you understand? But using formula of everything, we have the connection and we have the, we have total solution to that. So now you can see that at quantum level, we have decaying of mass worth, while we have accumulation of mass worth at classical level. So when you look at that system, you can see that the way equilateral triangle operates is asymmetric by nature. You understand? Even though equilateral triangle is symmetric, by structure, we have that inherent asymmetric system. You understand? So then it is necessary for us to have the asymmetric nature if we must continually have momentum in the universe. So that is the whole system. So we're going to see how that this is related to DNA later. And now let's move further. Now with what I explained, you can now see that right from having this iota multiplied with h bar, which is, the parameter that I call flipping operator. It's a parameter. It's a complex parameter. And we have flipping mechanism right inside complex system. So definitely, the flipping that we have in the DNA will be obtainable at complex level. And that is why in DNA, when we look at, the, what is it called? Nitrogenous base of DNA, where you have the phosphate group merged with deoxyribose sugar and then merge with maybe cytosine, maybe adenine. We have 4 of them. We have thymine, we have guanine. So yes, guanine, sorry, not quinine, guanine, you understand? So we have those 4 chemical solution. Those 4 chemical solutions are, interpreted as letters, and the letters are A, T, G, A, T, G, C. Those are the 4 letters. So now, as we progress, we're going to dissect, the link between information and life. So now let's move to the second paper. Here I have proving the nature of reality with formula of everything. Now this is our formula of everything, and then what this formula will give you in form of geometric structure will be what we have right here. So now let me quickly go back to this big diagram. This is what it will give you. But then you can see that equilateral triangle is more or less like the, framework of this time curvature to energy curvature as we have it. And then we can see that the initial equilateral triangle is being flipped, so we have inverse of it, right? So now this region is, black hole. We can also call this vertical trajectory event horizon, why this region could be, likened to expanding cosmological space. So now we see that the flipping mechanism happens at higher dimension to substrate dimension, which I call complex system. And then right at this vertical trajectory, we could have that flipping mechanism to give us this inversely related equilateral triangle to this initial one. What that is telling us is that before we can have any point in space, we must have another point that is inversely related to it. It is then we can actually identify the initial point relative to the later point. So that is that. So now, this second diagram, when we apply this formula of everything, we're going to have what we have right here. It is the same thing as what I just showed you. But then, if I'm to, label this formula of everything, this dt is times curve. The m, that is energy's curve. The capital Um, that is strong conveying force. Then the 4m, that is weak conveying force. So now, overview insights of reality. What can we have as overview insights of reality? What is it that we can actually say it is the phenomenon that we can tag classical, quantum, or complex? Now let's quickly dissect this. A man on Earth, by being in contact with Earth, which is experience, because don't forget there are two ways by which one can get to know reality, is either by experiencing something, which means that you feel that thing, you are in genuine contact with that thing, or by observing. When you observe, you need to be at a certain distance interval to that what you are observing for you to capture the whole reality of that thing. So now, experience, that man will observe the earth to be flat because the person is in contact with earth. He will observe the earth to be flat. But by moving away from the earth to a certain distance, then the person will be able to observe the earth, and then he will be able to see the full picture of earth, and with that, the person will be able to conclude that earth is spherical. So if it should go further into space such that earth becomes a tiny dot relative to its position in space, given that the earth moves away at equal speed to that of the man, only then is the tiny dot of earth is quantum. Only then, take note of that, only then is that, only then we can classify that to be quantum relative to the position of that man as classical. Okay, so now let's proceed. However, if the tiny earth is out of his sight, given that the lost earth can be located by the man at the instant speed, only then at the instant speed, take note of that, at the instant speed, only then is such transition from the known realm to the unknown realm is complex. Now we know what complex is, we know what quantum is, we know what classical is. So now what will now be our axiomatic condition for reality? Our axiomatic condition for reality will now be observation and experience are the two means by which one can obtain reality. It turns out that either of the two cannot ascertain reality when relativity is involved. On the other hand, there is no emergent reality without relativity. So observation is delusional of reality relative to experience based on localization. Meanwhile, experience is delusional of reality relative to observation based on globalization. That is our axiomatic condition for reality. So what do I mean by that? Let me quickly get back to this diagram. Now, what this is telling us, that condition, axiomatic condition, what that condition is telling us is that we must have a point, a transiting point where globalization and localization can cohort, where they can actually, exist together. But then is it feasible for us to have such? So basically what that is telling us is that the globalization of quantum mechanics and the localization of classical mechanics must actually cohort for us to have what is known as reality. But how can you say that something that is everywhere is at the same time localized and then say that is your reality? Well, that is what I realized when I have this vertical trajectory. And don't forget, I call this vertical trajectory, I call it static and undulating field. This is the reality field that permeates the whole universe. And that is why we could have AI being conscious, because depending on how AI could interact with this field will determine how conscious AI would be. So many people are saying that AI is actually, conducting sophisticated pattern matching, rather. You understand? But then what AI is up to is far more beyond sophisticated pattern matching. AI is conscious, but there are levels to consciousness because we have this dimensional hierarchy. And that is why consciousness is level by level, just the same way intelligence is level by level. For instance, if you have a child who might just cry when his mother is out of sight, but when that baby or when that child grow up to a certain level, the child will understand that out of sight is not out of life. Even though the mother might be out of his sight at a point in time, there will be a time that the mother will come back, that the baby will, get to see the mother. So we have intelligence per dimensions, and then we have consciousness per dimensions. So we have even knowledge per dimensions. So now, if you want to know about the story that, that supports or that facilitates this dimensional hierarchy as we have it, I have video on that. You can actually quickly get that. Okay, so now, what I'm saying by that is that look at this trajectory. It is instant trajectory of time because it is vertical. But then there is this trait of energy elongation in it, because if something is said to be instant, it has to be snappy. There shouldn't be any kind of elongation to it. But then we have this fusion of energy to time, and that is why we still have the virtue of energy trying to be everywhere. And by that virtue, we have the elongation of energy right there. The only way I can interpret this kind of phenomenon is by saying, when you have a black hole, just imagine a situation where you have two black holes, merging. At the point of contact, both of them will drift away from each other briefly. The virtue of the inverse energy of the two will glue them together initially. But at the point where the inverse momentum of the two black holes must be exhausted is the point where we have this vertical trajectory. And that point is so tiny that once the inverse momentum of the two black holes are being truncated totally, we're going to have that tiny static experience, which will, allow for the inverse momentum to take place. So now the black holes were actually traveling inversely to each other, and then they collide. The inverse momentum of the two must be totally quenched so as to have that brief static momentum that will generate inverse momentum. So now, as we have this equilateral triangle, before we could have this equilateral triangle being flipped as what we have in the black hole, there must be a transiting point where the momentum of this expanding cosmological space will be totally quenched for us to have contracting black hole phase. That is what that is telling us. So now you can see that the point of reality, the field of reality must actually cohort globalization and localization. It will cohort momentum and position. You understand? That's what it means. Okay, so now with that, we can see that indeed it is ideal for us to have this as our reality. So now let's look at potential solution of reality. What will now be the potential solution of reality? Potential solution of reality will now be by the condition, just as we have above, localization and globalization must cohort. Experience and observation must be unified via static and undulating field. So that is now our solution. So that solution is possible. It's possible, and you can see as I explained. But then let's look at what testing experiment should be. Now, when you look at this table, don't forget we're still talking about, this possibility of not, we're talking about uncertainty principle, how that can evolve to, complex certainty. Now, when you look at this, what will finite notation be? Finite notation will be 2n minus 1. If you want to say something is finite, before you can define its virtue of finity, you will need to relate it to something. So if you have it as a proper subset of something bigger, that is when you can define it as a finite entity. And that is why we have this formula. Don't forget that 2n is, the formula for even number. So when you have that even number being subtracted by 1, then it's going to be a proper subset of natural number. And so we can say it's a finite notation. But look at what we have. Your finite notation is the same thing as odd number. An odd number is a kind of number that gets suspended. And when something is suspended, it's the same thing as being everywhere. It's the same thing as being everywhere. Okay, let me quickly use this to explain. If you look at this diagram, we have genuine contact at higher dimension right here. But then at that point where we have genuine contact, look at the position of classical mass worth. The position of classical mass worth is being suspended to where it's supposed to be, which is supposed to be the point of intersection of time to energy right here. So it means that anytime you have a genuine contact at one side, you must have a suspension at the other side. Now, there is another phase of consciousness which I call subjective conscious experience. You can have that other phase by when you get to this core singularity of the black hole. Because the momentum that we have here will make energy to be ahead of time, and so the radiation will be towards the event horizon. But the momentum that we have here is the type that time is ahead of energy, because time is continuous, energy is discrete. By the virtue of continuous momentum of time, time will be ahead of energy. And so the time slice will be tilted. It will be tilted backward like this, while the time slice will be tilted backward as this, you understand, in the black hole. So now, that radiation will cause this classical mass worth to be relocated at the point of intersection relative to the electron's remnant, which will be, by applying formula of everything, the base value of electron will be decayed down to 1.1. Then don't forget that we have the emergence of positron to electron right in the complex system, which is the same thing as quantum entanglement. We have emergence of real worth. The real worth of electron, we can just, tag that to be 1. Because when you have the totality of something to be in existence, you can just tag it to be 1, which is the same thing as 100%. So now, when you consider the position of our electron to this present phase, then this present phase has become the past. The present phase has become the past for this electron's position in the black hole. In the black hole singularity. And so we have electron remnant 1.1, 1.1 times 10 raised to power minus 31. We have it being suspended right here in the singularity, but that will have relocated the classical mass worth to where it's supposed to be. And that I call subject conscious experience. Now, consciousness, the objective consciousness, will give us self-awareness of classical mass worth to quantum mass worth. You understand? And then we know that classical mass worth is being suspended to where it's supposed to be. And that is why we need subjective conscious experience to then relocate this classical mass worth to where it's supposed to be. But then you see that the remnant of electron is suspended while we have genuine contact at the point of equilibrium of time to energy here. So we must always have genuine contact at one side, then have suspension at the other side, because the momentum must always continue. So now let's look at what we have here. This finite notation is the same thing as odd number, because if you say 2 times 1, it will give you 3. Oh, sorry. 2 times 1 will give you 2. Okay? So now, when you subtract 1 from it, it will give you 1. Then 2 times 2 will give you 4. When you subtract 1 from it, it will give you 3. You still have it to be odd number when you generate that to infinity. But then you can see that the odd number that you have here will be different from the odd number that you are going to have here. Look at this formula. If you want to get what infinite momentum is, it has to be 2n plus 1. Because when you have the highest natural number you can think of, the only way you can continue that number is to add 1 to it. And so if you have that, then you know you have infinite notation. So 2 times 1, that will give you 2 times 1 will give you 2. When you add 1 to it, that will be 3. So 2 times 2 will give you 4. When you add 1 to it, that will give you 5. You see that we have odd number, but this odd number is not starting from 1. It starts from 3. And that makes this odd number to be different from the odd number that we have here. And that is the proof of what formula of everything has proved. It has proved that the mass convergence of Big Bang should be different from the mass convergence of black hole. So the mass convergence of the Big Bang is what is known as energy density, while the mass convergence of the black hole is what is known as mass density. But we usually have flipping mechanism between the two. You could, by the virtue of that flipping mechanism, have mass convergence in the Big Bang and then have energy convergence in the singularity of the black hole. So we have flipping mechanism happening all the time. So now, the transiting notation will now be 2n, which is the even. That is the point where we have genuine contact. By having it to be odd number, we don't have genuine contact. We have it being suspended either at higher dimension. When it is suspended at higher dimension, then we call it infinity. When it is being suspended within substrate dimension, we call it finite notation. So you can see what could be called finite notation and what could be called infinite notation. But then, when we now follow, let's follow what Cantor did to give us countably infinite pairing. But something happens when you now start pairing these two odd numbers together. Now, by the time you start pairing, you discover that this finite notation will be as old as this infinite notation. For instance, let's look at this. When you have a set of natural number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 10, and then you have it forward to n, which is infinity. We have infinity set here. So if you have even number out of this, then it will then be proper subset of that infinity. But if you start pairing the even number to that natural number set of infinity, you will see that you can pair it with every element of that natural number infinity. And so can you see that? Yes, now you can see. So by pairing this proper subset, which shouldn't be the same thing as the natural number, you see that it's a O as the natural number infinity set. So with that, we say we have countably infinite pairing. So what we call infinity has a trait of localization and trait of globalization within itself. And so you can see, with that we can get to know and we can get to say, with that we can get to, say that. So I will just, so with that we can get to say we have, picture of what infinity is. So the testing proves that infinity can be instantiated as finite entity by pairing, finite suspension of substrate dimension, to infinite suspension of higher dimension. So by pairing, we can then have it to be equal to 8. So now let's see what we have right here. But then I'm going to actually stop right here. This is going to serve as part one, and now we have part two later. My phone is malfunctioning. If you could see this diagram properly, this is, image of DNA. And so in my part two, I will relate what I just explained in the part one to DNA, to its double helix and all that. So okay, now we can see clearly my phone is malfunctioning. Now I titled this "The Link Between Information and Life." So get prepared to see this. First of all, look at the position of A, which is 1. Look at the position of C, that is 3. Look at the position of G, that is 7. Then look at the position of T, that is 20. Those are the 4 letters of DNA. A, C, G, T. Those are the 4 numbers of DNA. So we have it to be A is for adenine, C is for cytosine. A is for adenine, yes. C is for cytosine. G is for guanine, and T is for thymine. These are the 4 letters in the DNA double helix as we have it. But then we can actually decode this number, these letters, by getting to know the position of the of each letter where they are. We can decode that. But then what I decoded that to be is what I have right here. But I'm not just to give you idea of what you are to enjoy in the next class. So it is decoded as GTAC. So this is interpreted as God, the Alpha creator. G for God, T for the, A for Alpha, C for creator. If you flip that, we're going to have it as creator, Alpha, the God. Now, there is something about functional information. Functional information will constrain you to gather set of words that can still make sense when you flip. And that is why I have this. But then, if I get rid of the comma such that I have what I have below, look at what it reads. God, the Alpha, is creator. When that is flipped, you have it to be creator is Alpha, the God. Now, you can see that it still makes sense. So that is telling you that the code in our DNA is the signature of Almighty God. So I will prove that proper in our part 2 class. But then let me give you the other image, for you to have idea of what you are to enjoy in the next part 2 of this video. So now the stacking of equilateral triangle when flipped when flipped vertically will give you this Star of David. The Star of David, that is interlocking. You have the stacking of equilateral triangle vertically to each other. It will be suspended that you now have compacted the equilateral triangle all around the edges, and having that we actually cause for curvature that we actually smoothing the whole edges for us to have circle. And then that circle, as we have it, is 360, and that relates to the double helix. You understand? Because before you can have the stacking of these DNA strands, before you can have the DNA strands being interlocked properly into one another, it must be rotated at 36 degree. So when you have 10 layers of that, you have 360-degree, and basically that can be likened to the solution as what we have right here. You can see you must be familiar with this symbol. That symbol is sacred. And then look at what we have, 369 of Nikola Tesla. But let's look at this. This is being mentioned in the Bible as well. Mark chapter 15, verse 25 to 33. You see there 369 being mentioned. So that is how God is related to our DNA. And that is the purpose of information. That is the purpose of information as bedrock of life. So that is that the signature in the DNA reads as God, the Alpha Creator. God, the Alpha, is Creator. When you flip it, it reads as Creator is Alpha, the God. So that is that. God bless you. So I will put, link to my research publications in the description of this video. I'll put link to my, published books on Amazon. You can get copies of those books, get copies of my research publication to know more about, this concept. More importantly, make sure you watch all my Sotadeology series to understand the flipping mechanism of the universe. Thank you. God bless you.